Hello and welcome to Lost Love Chronicles.
Dear listeners, before we get started, drop a quick hi in the comments and let us know where you're tuning in from. Also, if you have any suggestions for us to make the channel better, please let us know. Now let's start with the story. I am Daniel Martin, 36 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. I live a disciplined life where every step is carefully calculated, every decision weighed against its consequences. But if you ask me where my heart truly belongs, I'll tell you about a mansion on a hill in the suburbs of Virginia. It's worth about $70 million, an immense fortune. That place, that house, is where I grew up, where I learned the meaning of love, responsibility, and integrity. It is not just a house, it is my entire world. My parents, Russell and Bethany Martin, instilled in me the values I carry with me to this very day. And let me tell you, this story isn't just about me. It's about family, about legacy, about the lessons that shaped who I am today. Our family mansion sits on a gentle hillside where towering pines stand like sentinels guarding the estate. Each morning, sunlight filters through the foliage, casting shimmering patches of light across the lawn, as if nature itself is painting a picture just for us. The house, with its pale gray stone walls and soaring windows, is more than an architectural marvel. It is a symbol of the love and dedication my parents poured into our lives. Every corner of that house, every room, tells a story about our family. I was born there, raised in the loving arms of my parents and in the laughter of my younger brother Edward. My father, Russell Martin, was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and sharp, piercing eyes. He built a renowned investment firm in Virginia, and people admired his success. But what made me respect him wasn't his wealth or his status, it was the way he lived. I still remember his words, spoken to me over and over again. Daniel, a man's worth isn't measured by the money he has, but by what he does when no one is watching. Those words are etched in my mind, serving as a compass for every decision I have ever made. He was strict, yes, but never lacking in love. Weekend mornings stick out in my memory. Dad would sit at the large dining table, the sunlight catching the rim of his silver-framed glasses as he read the newspaper. Edward and I would race around the house, wooden swords in hand, pretending to be knights battling dragons. "Slow down, you two," he would say, glancing up with a half-smile that tried so hard to look stern. We'd stop, breathless, waiting to see if we were in trouble. But then he'd soften. "My two boys, come here," he'd call us over. "Tell me what you learned today." We would plop down beside him, eager to share stories about school, about the neighbor's dog who kept sneaking into our yard, about how we'd scraped our knees climbing the tallest tree. He always listened, never interrupting, giving us his full attention. When we were done, he'd look at us, eyes kind but steady. "Remember, Daniel. Remember, Edward," he would say. "A man must take responsibility for his actions, no matter how hard it is. Always do what's right." My mother, Bethany, was the heart of our family. She had a gentle smile, eyes that shone like moonlight, and a warm voice that could melt away any sorrow. If my father taught me about responsibility and integrity, my mother taught me about love and selflessness. She was an intelligent woman, a former literature teacher who devoted all her time to our family. Every evening, my mother would sit by the fireplace, telling Edward and me fairy tales or reading us poetry. I can still hear her voice, soothing like a river, as she recited lines from Whitman or Frost. "Daniel, my boy," she would say, holding my hand gently but firmly. "Strength doesn't mean being tough. A true man knows how to love and forgive." Her words sank deep into me. She had a way of making everything feel special. Every year, for my or Edward's birthday, she would bake a large cream cake, decorating it with delicate sugar flowers she shaped with such care. I can almost smell the sweet aroma of cookies drifting from the kitchen, hear her soft humming floating through the halls, see her hands dusted with flour as she turned to hug us tightly. "You boys are my greatest treasures," she would say, looking into our eyes with such certainty I could never doubt it. And I believed it with all my heart. Edward, my younger brother, is 9 years my junior. He's different from me in so many ways. While I loved running around, climbing trees, or tossing a ball with the neighborhood kids, Edward preferred to sit alone with his sketchbook, quietly sketching the forest behind our house or the birds that wheeled across the sky. He was sensitive, even vulnerable, but his heart was resilient in a way I always admired. Edward was never the type to pick fights, but he stood his ground when it mattered. I remember one afternoon when he was only 7. A bigger boy from the neighborhood teased him for liking to draw, shoving him and calling him names. Edward just looked him in the eye, clutching his pencil like a sword. "I don't need to fight to prove I'm right," he said calmly. I remember laughing then, ruffling his hair, and feeling a sudden surge of pride. Even if he was quiet, Edward had a courage that was all his own. We grew up surrounded by love, but also under strict guidance. My parents never let us grow arrogant because of our privileged upbringing. You live in a beautiful house, my father would say, fixing his serious gaze on us, but don't let it define you. Money can buy a house, but only love and integrity build a family. The mansion, with its long hallways lined with antique paintings, and the flower garden my mother tended so lovingly, was more than just a home. It was a symbol, a living testament to the values my parents wanted to pass down to us. One of my fondest memories is of those family evenings in the grand dining room. The oak table was always dressed in a white silk cloth, and laden with dishes my mother had prepared herself: roast beef, creamy mashed potatoes, warm bread, and the rich smell of herbs filling the air. My father would raise his glass of wine, the candlelight catching in his eyes, and look around the table with a pride that was impossible to miss. "This is our legacy," he would say, voice deep and warm, echoing through the tall ceiling of the dining room. "Not the house, not the money, but love, integrity, and responsibility. You boys must preserve it, no matter what happens." Edward and I would nod, wide-eyed, even though back then I didn't fully grasp the weight of his words. I only knew that sitting at that table, hearing my mother's laughter, my father's strong yet gentle voice, and seeing Edward's bright, hopeful eyes, I felt safe. It was as if nothing in the world could ever break us apart. As I grew older, I began to understand my responsibilities. My father would often take me into his study, a warm, quiet place lined with dark shelves filled with books on history and philosophy. It smelled of old leather and ink, the faintest trace of pipe tobacco lingering in the corners. He would settle into the heavy oak chair and gesture for me to sit across from him. "Daniel," he'd say, tapping the cover of some heavy tome about ancient heroes. These men stood for something. They protected their families, their ideals, not with fists, but with their hearts and minds. One day, I remember him closing the book and looking straight into my eyes, so intensely that I could barely hold his gaze. One day, he told me, voice deep and solemn, "You'll have to protect what matters, not with your fists, but with your heart and mind." I nodded, though in truth I didn't fully understand. Still, the look in his eyes, stern, expectant, full of love, made me want to grow into a man he could be proud of. It was my parents' profound lessons that shaped who I am. When I finally decided to attend the United States Military Academy, I remember telling them over dinner. My mother had just set down a dish of roast chicken when I cleared my throat. "Dad, Mom," I said, steadying my voice, "I want to serve. I want to go to West Point." My father looked at me for a long moment, then nodded with an unmistakable pride. "Son, you're choosing a difficult path," he said, raising his glass slightly, "but I believe in you." My mother's eyes filled with worry, but she smiled bravely, reaching for my hand across the table. "Take your heart with you, Daniel," she said softly. "Don't let the military harden it." I hugged her, feeling the warmth of her embrace, breathing in her familiar scent of lavender and flower. "I promise, Mom," I whispered. "I won't ever forget what you taught me." Back then, I had no idea how that promise would be tested by losses and fractures I couldn't have foreseen. The mansion, once a symbol of love and unity, gradually became a battlefield where I had to fight to protect what was left of our family. I was 21, caught up in the grueling days at the academy, pushing my body and mind to their limits. One afternoon, after a punishing drill session that left me soaked in sweat and dust, I heard my name shouted across the training field. "Martin." I turned, blinking in the sun. The commanding officer was waiting. "Urgent call from your family. Get to the office." My heart slammed against my ribs, not from exhaustion, but from a cold, creeping dread I couldn't shake. I ran into the building, picked up the phone, and pressed it to my ear with trembling hands. "Hello." On the other end, Edward's voice was ragged and choked with sobs. "Daniel," he gasped. Mom's gone." The world crashed around me. I could barely breathe. "What did you say?" I asked, my voice breaking in a way I had never heard before. "Edward, Mom, how?" He sobbed so hard I could hear him struggling for air. "A car accident," he finally managed. "A truck lost control." My knees went weak, the room spinning, the white walls suddenly closing in. "Mom," the woman who was the light of our family, gone. I requested emergency leave immediately and booked the earliest flight back to Virginia. When the plane touched down, I was no longer Daniel Martin, the determined West Point cadet. I was just a son who had lost his mother, confused, broken, hollowed out. I stepped into the mansion, where the silence felt louder than any shout, where Mom's laughter had once filled every hallway. Even the sunlight through the big windows seemed dimmer, as if the house itself was grieving. I walked into the living room. Edward saw me and ran forward, burying his face against my chest, his tears soaking through my uniform. "Daniel," he cried, voice cracking, "Mom's not coming back, is she?" I swallowed hard, unable to speak, only holding him tighter, trying to stay upright as the world threatened to collapse around me. My father was sitting in the big armchair where he used to read the morning paper, but there was no paper in his hands now. Instead, he clutched Mom's silk handkerchief, the one she always kept tucked into her sleeve. His eyes were red, swollen, fixed on something far away. I wanted to go to him, to comfort him, to tell him we would be okay, but I just stood there frozen, helpless. He looked up at me, and I saw that his eyes were no longer those of the strong man I had always admired. They were empty, as if a part of his soul had left with Mom. Mom's funeral took place a week later, on a dreary, drizzling day. The skies seemed to mourn with us, a steady mist soaking the old stones of the small church near the mansion. Family, friends, and some of Dad's colleagues gathered under black umbrellas, speaking in hushed, broken voices. I stood by the coffin, staring at Mom's face, so peaceful it almost looked like she might wake up. My heart constricted until I thought it might break in two. Edward stood beside me, his hand trembling in mine. I could feel him shaking every time he took a breath. Dad kept his distance, standing in a dark corner as if he didn't want anyone to see him crumble. I wanted to scream, to rage at the world, to demand why this had happened, but there were no answers, and no words could bring her back. In the months that followed, the mansion felt alien to me. Laughter had vanished, replaced by a heavy, unbearable silence. Dad buried himself in his work, disappearing for long hours as though only business could shield him from his pain. Edward, just 12 then, became quiet and withdrawn. The sketches of birds and forests he once proudly showed off were forgotten. Instead, he would sit in his room, clutching the wool scarf Mom had knitted him the previous winter, staring at nothing. I tried to be there for him, but my studies and training at the academy left me with only weekend visits or hurried phone calls. One night, Edward's small voice came through the receiver, barely audible. "Daniel, do you think Mom's watching us?" I gripped the phone, swallowing hard, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Mom's always here, Edward," I said, trying to sound strong for him. "In our hearts." But even as I said the words, they felt so hollow. Nothing could fill the void she'd left. 2 years after Mom's passing, I graduated from the military academy and launched into my career. The Army demanded everything from me, days that blurred into weeks of training, deployments, and missions that consumed every bit of my attention. Still, every time I returned to the mansion, I felt the emptiness settle on my shoulders like a weight I couldn't shake off. Dad was always busy, even more relentless than before, yet somehow colder too. The family dinners that had once overflowed with warmth were gone, just shadows and memories. Edward grew older, but a kind of sadness clung to him that I couldn't erase, no matter how hard I tried. Then one day, after I came back from a training stint, Dad called me into his study. The room was just as I remembered, the shelves lined with books, the faint scent of leather and dust. But something was different in the air, heavy and tense. Dad sat behind his massive desk, hands folded, his eyes shifting with a strange mix of nervousness and apprehension, an emotion I'd rarely seen on his face. "Daniel," he began, clearing his throat, voice low and rough. "I need to tell you something." I watched him carefully, waiting. He exhaled. I'm getting remarried." It was as if someone had slammed their fist into my chest. "Remarried," I repeated, trying to keep my voice calm, though it came out tight and cold. The man who had called Mom the love of his life now wanted to replace her? He nodded, avoiding my eyes. "Her name is Vanessa," he said. "A woman I met through work. She understands me, Daniel. She brought light after years of darkness." I clenched my jaw, wanting to scream at him that no one could ever replace Mom, that her memory should never be buried by someone else's smile. But then I saw the look in his eyes, not the look of a man in love, but a man desperately trying to fill a bottomless void. I nodded stiffly, too angry to trust my voice. And then Vanessa entered our lives like a strange breeze. She was beautiful, with glossy blonde hair that fell perfectly around her shoulders, a polished smile that never seemed to waver. But there was something in her eyes that made me distrust her. Vanessa didn't come alone. She brought along her daughter, Hazel, who was Edward's age, 14. Hazel had her mother's beauty, the same sculpted features and blonde hair, but a sharp, snarky personality that grated on me the moment we met. At our first introduction, Vanessa hugged me, her perfume thick and cloying. "Daniel," she cooed, voice dripping honey, "I've heard so much about you. I hope we'll be close." Her words were sweet, but every syllable felt suffocating, fake, crawling across my skin like something I wanted to shake off. Hazel was different, bolder, more pointed. As Edward and I showed her the garden, she turned up her nose, eyes darting over Mom's roses as if they were trash. "This house is huge," she said with a smirk, twirling a strand of her perfect hair between her fingers. "But it must be so boring, right, Edward?" I saw Edward lower his head, shoulders shrinking inward, silent. My hands balled into fists, and it took every ounce of my military training to keep myself from snapping right then and there. Soon after, Vanessa and Hazel moved into the mansion. Dad arranged a small wedding, only a handful of close friends and colleagues attending. I stood there in my military uniform, the polished brass buttons catching the afternoon light, trying to force a smile for Dad. My heart felt as heavy as lead. Edward, in a small dark suit, clung to my hand so tightly I could feel his fingers digging into my skin. "Daniel," he whispered, voice shaking, "will everything be okay?" I squeezed his hand hard, trying to anchor him, even though I didn't believe my own words. "It'll be fine, little brother," I promised. "I won't let anything happen to you." But deep down, I knew I was lying. Vanessa and Hazel's arrival marked the first true crack in our family. Vanessa wasted no time taking over the mansion, changing everything to match her tastes. Mom's cherished rose bushes, the ones she had planted with Edward and me when we were kids, were ripped out and replaced with cold, exotic flowers that meant nothing to us. The paintings Mom had chosen so carefully, each one telling a story of our family's history, were stripped from the walls and replaced with harsh modern art that looked sterile and empty. I tried, I really did, to accept it, for Dad's sake, but every change felt like a blade carving into my memories of Mom, leaving me raw and bleeding inside. Edward suffered the most. He began to call me, his voice thin and fragile, telling me about Hazel's cruel jabs. "She calls me a weak kid," he admitted once over the phone, trying so hard not to cry, or an outsider. One night, he couldn't hold back the tears. "Daniel," he sobbed, "Hazel stole the picture I drew for Mom, the forest picture. She tore it up in front of me and laughed. Vanessa told me not to make a big deal out of it." My blood turned to fire. That picture, Edward had poured his heart into that drawing, sketching the pines behind our house, the forest Mom loved so much. It was his way of keeping her close, and they had destroyed it. I couldn't stand it. I requested emergency leave and flew home that same night. When I stepped into the living room, I saw them. Vanessa on the couch, legs crossed elegantly, Hazel standing behind her like a little queen. Dad lingered in the corner, pretending to read, but not really seeing the pages. I stepped forward, voice trembling with barely restrained rage. "If you ever touch Edward again," I said, my tone low and sharp, "I won't let it slide." Vanessa gave me that honey-sweet smile I had come to despise, tilting her head like a snake about to strike. "Daniel, you've misunderstood," she purred, "we're family." Hazel just stood behind her mother, smirking, her eyes glittering with challenge as if daring me to do something. I turned to Dad, silently pleading for him to speak up, to defend Edward the way he once defended us, but he wouldn't even meet my eyes. He stared at the floor, helpless, broken, refusing to face the conflict. In that moment, I felt something crack between us. The loyalty I had for him, the belief that he would always protect us, began to slip away. I knew then I couldn't let Edward stay trapped in that toxic environment. He was too sensitive, too vulnerable to face Vanessa and Hazel's cruelty. I started searching for a solution, any way to get Edward out of that poison mansion before it swallowed him whole. After weeks of research, I found a prestigious boarding school in Massachusetts. It had excellent academics, a supportive environment, a place where he could live safely and breathe again. The tuition was high, but I used every penny of my savings, tightening my belt for months, telling myself it was worth every sacrifice if it meant protecting Edward. The day I came to take him, Edward stood at the mansion's gate, a backpack clutched to his chest, stuffed with Mom's keepsakes, her scarf, a small book of poems, the picture of the forest he had redrawn since Hazel had destroyed the first. "Daniel," he said, voice quivering, "I don't want to leave home." His eyes were red, swollen from crying. "But I also don't want to stay here with them." I knelt in front of him, resting my hands on his shoulders so he could see nothing but my eyes. "Little brother," I told him gently, "this isn't leaving home. Home is where you and I are. I'll always be here whenever you need me." He nodded, wiping at his cheeks, trusting me the way he always had. As we turned toward the car, Dad stepped out from the mansion, standing under the archway. His voice was raw, a deep wound behind every word. "Daniel," he called, "what are you doing?" I paused, turning to face him. "This is Edward's home, our home," he insisted, pain radiating from him like a dying star. I swallowed, fighting the tremor in my own voice. "No, Dad," I said quietly, meeting his gaze. "It's not our home anymore. Dad looked at me, stunned, as though my words had knocked the breath out of him. But I couldn't stay to soothe him. I took Edward's hand and guided him into the car, refusing to look back as we pulled away from the mansion, once a place of warmth, now just ashes. I knew I had done the right thing, protecting Edward. But inside, a dull ache gnawed at me. My father, the man who had once been my greatest hero, now felt like a stranger, more distant than any enemy I had ever faced. And I, Daniel Martin, stood at a crossroads of loyalty and hurt, wondering if our family could ever be mended. In the years that followed, with Edward settled in at the boarding school, I threw myself back into my work. The military became my rock, its rigid rules, its harsh routines, all familiar and stabilizing. Every command drilled into me echoed the lessons Dad had once taught me. Discipline, loyalty, responsibility. I advanced quickly, earning several commendations and medals. Each time I stood on a parade ground, receiving praise from commanders, I thought of Dad, of how his eyes had shone with pride when I graduated from the academy. There were moments, medals pinned to my chest, where I would reach for the phone, wanting to call him, to hear his voice again. But every time, my hand froze, heavy with doubt. The distance between us, though measured in mere miles, felt deeper than any ocean. Edward, now an 18-year-old teenager, called me sometimes from school. His voice had grown steadier, though I could still hear the sadness buried in every syllable. "Daniel," he said one late night, his voice quiet over the static, "I miss home." I closed my eyes, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Not the mansion," he added quickly, "but our family, the way it used to be." I forced my voice to stay steady, even though everything inside me hurt. "Me too, little brother," I told him. "But don't worry too much. I'll always be here for you." I tried, again and again, to reconnect with Dad. But each phone call was short and painfully awkward. The man who had once asked me about knights and dragons and lessons from history barely knew what to say to me now. Vanessa was always there, hovering, slipping her sugary words between us. "Daniel, your father's very busy," she would say in that carefully sweet tone, "but he's so proud of you." I could feel her presence, sly and polished, building an invisible wall between Dad and me. It was on a stormy day, thunder rattling the windows of my office, when the call came. I was 31 by then, a lieutenant colonel with a calendar stacked to the minute. But none of that mattered when I heard Edward's voice, panicked and thin through the line. "Daniel," he gasped, barely holding it together. "Dad's sick, really sick." My heart clenched in my chest. I gripped the phone tightly. "What's wrong? Who told you?" I forced myself to keep my tone steady, though everything inside me was spiraling. Edward's voice cracked. "Mr. Turner called me, Dad's friend. He said, 'Daniel, Dad has liver cancer. It's bad. Final stage. Final stage.'" I felt the words slam into me like a bullet. My father, the man who had once stood as strong as a mountain, who seemed unshakable even on the worst days, was dying. Without hesitation, I put in for emergency leave, pushing aside every duty, every responsibility, because at that moment there was only one mission: get home. When the plane landed in Virginia, I wasn't Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Martin anymore. I was just a son, desperate to see his father and somehow heal the wounds I had left to fester for too long. But as I arrived at the mansion, that familiar iron gate, now cold and unwelcoming, I was met by the last person I wanted to see. Vanessa. She stood at the entrance in an expensive silk dress, perfectly tailored, her hair immaculate, her practiced smile unchanged. Behind her, two security guards stood like silent sentinels, arms crossed, eyes cold and blank. "Daniel," she cooed, "you're here. Your father, he's very weak." Not seeing anyone, I tried to keep my breathing even, but I felt rage building under my skin. "I'm his son," I said, voice sharp. "I want to see my father." Vanessa shook her head with that false, pitying tilt, her voice dripping sugar. "The doctor said he needs rest, Daniel. Please understand." I clenched my teeth so hard it hurt. Part of me wanted to shove past her, to tear through the hallways I knew so well until I reached Dad's bedside. But years in uniform had trained me to control my impulses, to weigh every move, even when my heart was screaming. I glanced at the two guards. Their eyes were flat, their stances rigid, ready to step in if I made a single wrong move. My fists tightened until my nails dug painfully into my palms, but I refused to show weakness. I took a slow, steady breath, choosing my words carefully. "Vanessa," I said, voice low, every syllable laced with barely restrained fury, "you have no right to stop me. My father is in there, and I will see him, whether you like it or not." She tilted her head, that polished smile still painted on her lips, but in her eyes, just for a second, I caught a flash of something cold and triumphant. Daniel, she sighed, as though speaking to a child, you're too emotional. Go home. I'll call you when your father is feeling better. Her tone was a velvet-coated slap, sweet but cruel, treating me like a stranger instead of the son of the man dying in the room behind her. I looked from her to the massive iron gate, a gate that had once been a welcome sign of home, but now felt like the bars of a prison. I took a step back, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to think, to breathe. I wasn't that impulsive boy anymore. I was an officer, trained to be calm even under fire. But this wasn't a battlefield, this was family, and somehow that made it so much harder. I met Vanessa's cold, unblinking gaze and felt a promise harden inside me. You'll regret this, I told her, voice steady, carved from steel. Then I turned and walked back to my car. Sitting in the car, I gripped the steering wheel so hard I thought it might crack. My breathing was heavy, ragged. I couldn't let Vanessa control everything, not this. My father was inside, frail, maybe needing me more than ever. I closed my eyes, remembering his voice, the way his eyes had gleamed with pride the day I graduated from West Point. A man must stand up for what matters. Dad had always mattered more than anything. I pulled out my phone and dialed the local police. My thumb shook as I pressed the numbers, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. A calm female voice came through the line. Fairfax County Police, how can we assist you? I swallowed, trying to keep my tone steady. My name is Daniel Martin, I said. I'm at my family's mansion, 1427, Oakwood Road. My father is gravely ill, and the woman inside, not my mother, is refusing to let me see him. I'm his son. I have every right to be there. The dispatcher's voice stayed neutral and professional as she asked for a few more details. I gave them quickly, clipped but clear, every word carrying the urgency boiling under my skin. We'll send a unit right away, she assured me. I hung up, letting a fraction of the tension drain from my shoulders. Still, the knot in my chest didn't loosen. I sat there staring at the iron gate, willing it to open, willing time to hurry up. 15 minutes later, blue and red lights cut through the dusk. A patrol car pulled up, and two officers stepped out, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense expression and a younger woman carrying a notepad. I jumped out of my car, introducing myself in as calm a voice as I could manage, quickly explaining everything again. The male officer nodded, giving the gate a wary glance. We'll talk to her, he said. Stay calm, sir. I stood back, heart hammering, as they rang the bell. After a long moment, Vanessa appeared at the doorway, her silk dress catching the dying light. Her smile was sickeningly sweet, as if nothing at all was wrong. Oh, officers, she said, voice syrupy. What's the matter? I stood behind them, every muscle in my body taut. The female officer spoke, calm but firm. We received a report that Mr. Martin here is being prevented from seeing his father. He is the son of the homeowner, and he has a right to enter. Vanessa blinked dramatically, her face a perfect mask of innocence. Oh, goodness, it's all a misunderstanding, she said lightly, turning to me with that same too smooth smile. Daniel, I wasn't stopping you. Your father is just very weak, and I was trying to protect him. Her gaze hardened even as her lips stayed curved. If you want to come in, of course you can. I'm only looking out for your father's well-being. I clenched my jaw so tightly I thought it might crack. She was lying, performing, but in front of the officers I had no choice but to play along. I want to go in now, I told her, voice clipped, unyielding. She nodded, pivoting gracefully as if she'd always intended to welcome me, and opened the gate. The two guards stepped aside, though they kept their eyes locked on me, cold and watchful. I stepped inside, following Vanessa through the grand foyer that once smelled of Mom's roses. The air was thick with her perfume instead, cloying and unfamiliar. Mom's paintings were gone, erased from the walls like she'd never existed. We climbed the stairs in silence, the click of Vanessa's heels echoing against the marble. Finally, she gestured to the master bedroom door. He's in there, she murmured, still dripping that artificial sympathy. The officer stayed back outside the doorway as I reached for the handle, my pulse roaring in my ears. I stepped in, my heart pounding. Dad lay in bed, so frail I barely recognized him. His skin had turned pale, almost waxy, and his once sharp eyes were cloudy, dulled by exhaustion and pain. Medical tubes coiled around him like chains, tying him to the machines that kept him alive. I felt my chest constrict as I stepped closer, then knelt beside him, taking his hand carefully in mine. The faint warmth in those thin fingers made my throat tighten. Dad? I whispered, voice shaking. It's me. His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment I saw a trace of the father I knew. A faint smile, weak but genuine, tugged at his lips. Daniel, my boy, he rasped, each word a battle. Then a tear slipped from the corner of his eye. I'm sorry for everything. I swallowed hard, feeling the burn behind my eyes. There were so many things I wanted to ask, to demand. Why did you let Vanessa take over? Why did you push Edward and me away? But none of that came out. I just held his hand tighter, letting the tears stream down my face. I'm here, Dad, I told him, voice breaking. I'll always be here. From the doorway, I felt Vanessa's eyes on me, cold and watchful, like a blade against my spine. The officers glanced at us one last time, then nodded politely to her. Looks like everything's in order, the male officer said. Call us if you need anything. I watched them go, their footsteps fading down the stairs. As the sound of the patrol car disappeared outside, Vanessa's pleasant mask melted away. Her smile turned sharp and venomous. She clapped her hands, and the two guards moved in behind me, quick as shadows. Daniel, she said, her voice stripped of any sweetness, you've seen your father. Now leave. I stood, turning to face her, fighting to stay calm even as my hands shook. You can't kick me out of my own home, I growled, my voice low. She tilted her head, eyes gleaming with a predatory calm. Don't make this worse, she warned. Your father needs peace, and you are causing a disturbance. Before I could answer, the guards grabbed my arms, their grip iron-strong. I twisted, trying to break free, but they were faster, stronger, and I refused to risk hurting Dad by fighting them in front of his sickbed. Vanessa, you'll pay for this, I shouted as they dragged me across the marble floor. She followed, her heels clicking like a metronome behind me, her tone cold and unfeeling. Daniel, she called out, almost gently, don't come back here to stir up trouble. Think of your father. The guards shoved me past the front doors and out through the iron gate. The heavy door clanged shut behind me like a prison lock. I stood there in the dusk, breath coming in ragged gasps, staring at the house that had once been my haven. I had seen Dad, but only for those few precious, painful minutes, and Vanessa had ensured it would be the last. I pulled out my phone, hands trembling, thinking of calling the police again. But I knew deep down they wouldn't help. Vanessa was too skilled, too manipulative, too careful at hiding her schemes. But I couldn't give up. Dad was in there, frail, maybe dying, and I knew he still needed me, needed Edward, even if just to hold his hand one more time. When I finally got back to the military base, my body was there, but my mind wasn't. I went through briefings and orders, but none of it landed. All I could think about was how to break through the fortress Vanessa had built around my father. The days that followed were a blur of desperate efforts. I called Dad every day, sometimes 3 or 4 times. I would pace my barracks, listening to the phone ring endlessly before rolling to voicemail. That same hollow recording. This is the Martin residence. Please leave a message. I left dozens of messages, my voice shifting from calm to pleading to angry, never knowing which would work. Vanessa, please, let me speak to my father. I'm his son, I said again and again, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. But there was never a reply. I tried texting, short messages that felt like prayers sent into the wind. Dad, it's Daniel. I want to know how you're doing. Please call me. But the phone screen stayed silent, blank and uncaring, as if my words had fallen into a black hole. I didn't stop there. I refused to let Vanessa cut off every path. I began to write letters, long, handwritten letters, the way Mom used to when she had something truly important to say. I poured my heart into every word, telling Dad about my days in the military, about Edward, about the quiet ache I felt whenever I thought of those family evenings by the fireplace. I wrote about the roast beef dinners, the way Mom laughed, how Edward's sketches used to brighten the hallways. I told him I was sorry for letting so much distance grow between us, sorry for not fighting harder, and most of all that I wanted to see him. Even just one more time. I signed every letter with I love you, Dad, and mailed them to the mansion, praying they would reach him. But the days turned to weeks, and nothing came back. No reply. No sign he'd even read them. I started to wonder if Vanessa had intercepted every word, shredding my letters the same way she had shredded every bond one had with my father. I reached out to Edward, who was in his final year of college by then. His voice sounded so much older on the phone, but heavy, beaten down. Daniel, he said, frustrated. I called Dad too, but Vanessa always picks up. She says he's sleeping or he's in treatment. But I don't believe her. She's doing something, Daniel. His pain cut straight through me, a blade under my ribs. I wanted to comfort him, to promise him everything would be fine, but I couldn't lie to my little brother. I'll find a way, Edward. I promised, though deep down I didn't even know where to start. I tried contacting Dad's old friends, reaching out to people who might still have a way in, people like Mr. Turner. But he, too, was shut out. She won't let anyone near, Turner told me over the phone, his voice weighed down by defeat. I tried to visit Russell, but she told me he didn't want to see anyone. I don't know what else to do. The helplessness in his voice only deepened my own. I felt a burning anger, But more than that, I felt like a complete failure. I was a lieutenant colonel, trained to lead soldiers through hell itself, yet against Vanessa, I was powerless. I couldn't even protect my father as he fought for his life. Then, about a month later, while I was at the base preparing for a strategy briefing, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, the mansion's number. My heart leapt into my throat, hoping maybe, just maybe, it was Dad. But as I answered, Vanessa's icy voice poured through the speaker like poison. "Daniel," she said, crisp and formal. "I'm calling to inform you your father, Russell, passed away this morning." I froze, the briefing room spinning around me, my breath leaving my lungs in a violent rush. "No, that's not possible," I whispered, but she went on, detached and clinical, like she was reading a grocery list. "He passed peacefully," she continued. "I did my best to care for him. The funeral will be this weekend. You and Edward should come." I couldn't even remember if I responded. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. All I could feel was the emptiness crashing through me, cold and merciless. Dad, the man who had taught me everything I knew about loyalty, about responsibility, about being a man, was gone. And I hadn't been there. I hadn't been at his side in his final moments. I called Edward right away, my voice cracking under the weight of it all. "Edward, I managed, Dad is gone." On the other end of the line, my brother broke. "Why?" he sobbed, his voice strangled. "Why weren't we allowed to see him? Why, Daniel?" I didn't have an answer. His pain felt like my own, tearing my heart open. "I don't know." I choked out. "I don't know, little brother." We couldn't change it. All we could do was bury the man who had once held our world together. I picked Edward up from his dorm, and we boarded the flight to Virginia together, silent, both of us locked in our own grief. When we arrived, we went straight to the small church near the mansion, the same one where Mom's funeral was held. I felt like I was reliving a nightmare. The sky was the same dull gray, the air heavy with that suffocating stillness that only funerals seem to hold. A crowd gathered, Dad's old friends, his colleagues, even strangers I didn't recognize, all there to pay their final respects. Vanessa and Hazel stood at the center like royalty, acting their parts as the grieving wife and daughter. Vanessa wore an elegant black dress, a single string of pearls resting at her throat, tears rolling down her cheeks in perfect, theatrical streams. But her eyes were cold, distant. I could see it clearly even through the veil of false mourning she wore. Hazel stood beside her, her head bowed in apparent sorrow, but when our eyes met, a faint smirk flickered across her lips, vanishing as quickly as it came. I stood back with Edward, gripping his hand, trying to stay strong for him. He leaned against me, trembling. My own chest felt like it was being crushed under the weight of regret, heavier than any burden I'd carried in uniform. I looked at Dad's coffin, the polished wood reflecting the dim church lights, and guilt slammed into me. I hadn't been there. I hadn't broken through Vanessa's wall. I had failed him when he needed me most. Edward's voice was a raw whisper. "Daniel, do you think Dad will forgive us?" I turned to him, hugging him close, swallowing hard against the lump in my throat. "Dad always loved us, Edward," I told him, forcing the words to stay steady. "Nothing will ever change that. Nothing." After the service ended, people offered us quiet condolences and drifted away one by one. Edward and I decided to go back to the mansion, not to claim anything grand, but just to gather a few of Dad's keepsakes. His favorite wristwatch, maybe, or that old leather notebook where he used to write thoughts about Mom. Anything that might help us feel close to him again, to remind us that he was still watching over us. When we arrived at the mansion, the iron gate loomed before us, locked, an unmovable wall between us and the place we'd called home. Vanessa was waiting at the entrance, Hazel beside her, both of them standing there like gatekeepers of some twisted kingdom. "Daniel, Edward," Vanessa began, her voice syrupy sweet but sharpened at the edges. "I'm so sorry about your father, but you can't come in." The words felt like a slap across my face. "This is our home," I said, fighting to keep my tone level. "We just want a few of Dad's keepsakes. That's all." Vanessa shook her head, the fake sympathy returning to her smile. "This house now belongs to me and Hazel. Russell made a will before he passed, leaving everything to us. If you want to contest it," she pulled out a folded paper, handing it to me with a flourish. "Talk to my lawyer." I unfolded it, scanning Dad's signature at the bottom, the weight of it making my stomach turn. Everything, the mansion, the property, the legacy, all signed away. Edward clutched my sleeve, his hand shaking. "Daniel," he whispered, tears brimming in his eyes, "Dad wouldn't do this. He loved us. He wouldn't." I looked at my little brother, my heart breaking all over again. I wanted to tear down the iron gate, to rush inside, to reclaim what was ours, what Mom and Dad had built from love. But Vanessa's eyes, hard as stone, told me she knew she had won. I took a breath, steadying myself. Vanessa, I said, my voice flat, controlled. You may keep this house, but you can't take what our parents left us. I'll find the truth. She didn't answer, just smiled that cold, perfect smile, and gestured to the guards behind her. They didn't move to hurt us, but their silent, watchful presence was a clear threat. I turned to Edward, gently tugging him back toward the car. Come on, little brother, I said, keeping my voice calm for his sake. We'll find a way. As I pulled away from the mansion, something inside me reignited, a fire I hadn't felt since I first put on my uniform. Vanessa and Hazel might think they'd won, that they had buried the past along with my father. But they were wrong. I was Daniel Martin, son of Russell and Bethany Martin, raised to fight for what's right. The mansion wasn't just property. It was the symbol of everything my parents had built together, their love, their struggles, their values. I wasn't going to let schemers rip that legacy away. I glanced at Edward sitting next to me, still clutching the old backpack filled with Mom's keepsakes. His eyes were vacant, lost somewhere between grief and a fragile determination. I knew that look because it mirrored my own heart. As I drove him back to my small apartment on the outskirts of Virginia, the place I used whenever I was off duty from the base, Edward barely spoke. When we stepped inside, he sank onto the worn sofa, holding tight to Mom's scarf like a lifeline. Daniel, he finally whispered, his voice so small it almost broke me. Did Dad really make that will? I knelt in front of him, placing a hand on his shoulder, steady and reassuring. Edward, I don't believe it. Dad loved us. He would never just cut us out like that. I swallowed, forcing strength into my voice. I will find out what's going on, I promise. He nodded weakly, but I could still see that doubt flicker in his eyes. I started where I knew I had to, with Mr. Turner, Dad's closest friend, the only one who had tried to warn me before. I called him, and he agreed to meet at the coffee shop Dad used to take me to as a boy. When I walked in, I saw him in a corner booth, hunched slightly, a worn hat in his hands. His face was deeply lined, his eyes full of worry. Daniel, he said, voice rough and low, I tried to tell you, son. I sat down across from him, leaning in. Tell me everything, Mr. Turner. I need the truth. He sighed, running a shaky hand across the table. Vanessa controlled everything once Russell got sick. I tried to visit, but she shut me out. Daniel, I don't trust her. I never did, but I had no proof. I told him about the will, about how Vanessa claimed the entire estate for herself and Hazel. Turner shook his head sharply, the edge of anger breaking through. Russell wouldn't do that, Daniel. You know how much he loved you boys. That house, that's your family's legacy, not hers. He paused, lowering his voice even more. There's someone you should see. Henry Graham, your father's lawyer for decades. If anyone knows the truth about that will, it's him. The next morning, I tracked down Henry Graham's office, a quiet, dignified suite in a weathered brick building downtown. The smell of old leather and paper hit me the second I stepped inside, memories flooding back of Dad bringing me here as a child, explaining what integrity meant even in legal matters. Graham himself opened the door, silver hair perfectly combed, his face warm but etched with concern. Daniel, he greeted me, extending a firm hand. I'm so sorry about your father. He motioned me inside and gestured to a chair across from his polished wooden desk. I wanted to reach out, but Vanessa, she made things difficult. I leaned forward, gripping my knees to stop them from shaking. Henry, she showed us a will. She locked us out, claimed everything belongs to her, and Hazel. Graham's brow darkened. He listened closely, nodding, but I saw his hand tighten around the pen resting on his desk. Daniel, he said slowly, with a gravity that sent a chill down my back. I worked for your father for over 30 years. I knew Russell like I knew myself. He would never leave everything to Vanessa. Never. Without securing something for you and Edward. He stood and unlocked a drawer behind him, pulling out a thick file, its edges marked with sticky notes and paper clips. Setting it before me, he met my eyes with a solemn expression. This, he said, tapping the folder, is what you need to know. I leaned forward, heart thudding against my ribs. Before he became gravely ill, Russell set up a secret trust. He wanted to ensure the mansion and most of his assets went to you and Edward, protected from anyone trying to take advantage. My breath caught. The will Vanessa presented, Graham continued, voice tightening. I questioned its legitimacy. My throat went dry. You mean? I swallowed, the words scraping out of me. The will could be fake? Graham nodded, the lines on his face deepening with concern. Possibly, Daniel. Or it was made under duress, when Russell was no longer lucid. Vanessa was present at every final meeting with other lawyers, and I was excluded. That's highly unusual. A cold fury coiled through my chest. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the edge in it. So you're telling me, I asked, my fists clenching against my thighs, that she didn't just keep me away from Dad. She might have manipulated him in his final days. Graham sighed, nodding gravely. That's exactly what I'm saying. A spark of hope flared somewhere inside me, fragile, but enough to keep me standing. How do we prove it? I demanded. It won't be easy, Daniel, he warned, leaning forward. We need evidence, the original trust paperwork, any recordings or documents showing Russell's true wishes. Vanessa is careful, but she is not perfect. I'll begin investigating from my end, comb through every scrap of documentation I can find. But you need to do your part too. Talk to anyone who was close to your father in those final months. Anyone who might have seen something. I nodded, swallowing down the anger that still burned in my chest. Okay, I said, I can do that. As I stepped out of Graham's office, the stale autumn wind hit my face. A swirl of fallen leaves skittered around my boots. I took a deep breath, grounding myself. I'd been trained for tough challenges. The military taught me to stay patient, plan, adapt, and never give up. If I could face war zones, I could face this. I pulled out my phone and called Edward. His voice came through shaky but hopeful. Daniel, listen, I told him, my own voice firm. There's a chance Dad left a trust for us, and Graham thinks the will Vanessa showed might be fake. There was a pause on the line, then a surge of excitement. Daniel, if Dad did that for us, Vanessa's lying, Edward blurted out. We have to do something. I let out a faint, tired smile. We will, I promised. Together, we'll fight this. Over the next days, I launched my own investigation. I started with people Dad had trusted, his secretary, his driver, even the gardener. But most had been dismissed the moment Vanessa took over. Then there was Cecilia, the housekeeper who'd served our family for nearly 20 years before suddenly quitting. When she agreed to meet me, I felt a sliver of relief. We met at a small park near her modest home. The second she saw me, Cecilia pulled me into a hug, her voice breaking. Daniel, she whispered, I'm so sorry about your father. He was a good man. A good man. I held her arms gently. Cecilia, please, tell me everything you know. She nodded, swallowing hard. Vanessa controlled everything in those last months, she explained, her eyes darting around the park as if afraid someone might be listening. She fired most of us, replaced us with people who would obey her. Her voice dropped. I overheard Vanessa once, she said, on the phone with someone. She talked about a new lawyer, not Mr. Graham, and something about papers being handled. I think she was planning something, Daniel. A chill ran down my spine. Cecilia's words felt like a missing puzzle piece sliding into place. Thank you. I told her, my voice hoarse. If you remember anything else, promise you'll call me. She nodded, squeezing my hand before hurrying off. I pressed on. I called doctors who had treated Dad, but they hid behind patient privacy rules, refusing to share anything. Still, I didn't give up. Finally, a former nurse, a kind woman named Beth, agreed to talk over the phone. Her voice was low and tense. Lieutenant Colonel Martin, she began, I shouldn't be telling you this, but Vanessa was always there when your father signed things. Russell looked so weak sometimes, like he didn't even know what he was signing. My hand tightened around the phone. Thank you. I told her, swallowing hard. Thank you for being honest. It was enough to keep me going. Working with Graham in the following days, we dug through every lead. Then one afternoon he called me back to his office, his voice tense. Daniel, he said as I stepped inside, I found something. A series of account transfers. I frowned. What kind of transfers? He pulled out bank statements, his finger tapping firmly against the highlighted lines. Some of your father's accounts, he explained, were moved into Vanessa's name before his death. It was unlike Dad to ever leave financial matters sloppy. He'd been meticulous his entire life, double-checking even the smallest transactions. Graham leaned forward, tapping the papers spread across his oak desk. Daniel, these transfers into Vanessa's name. They're highly suspicious, he said, voice tight. But without the original trust, it's hard to prove. We have to find it. His words burned into my mind as I left his office, determination battling with the exhaustion clawing at my chest. Days later, a letter arrived at my small apartment. The thick, ivory paper practically reeked of arrogance. When I opened it, the polished, threatening words of Christian Wallace, Vanessa's lawyer, leapt off the page. Cease all harassment of my client. Any further slander will result in legal consequences. I tore it in half and dropped the pieces straight into the trash. They think a letter will scare me? I was done letting them push us around. Edward agreed. When I told him what I planned, he looked at me with the same stubborn fire I saw every time I glanced in the mirror. Daniel, let's go back there, he insisted. Not to ask, to demand. I nodded, proud of him. So we drove to the mansion. As the gates creaked open, Hazel stood there, arms folded, smirking. What do you want now? She snapped, her voice dripping venom. Mom already made it clear, this house is ours. I took a breath, stepped forward, and locked eyes with her. We want to see the will, I told her firmly. The original, not some copied printout. Hazel scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder, then yelled over her shoulder, Mom. They're here again. Vanessa appeared moments later, perfectly put together as always, wrapped in a black silk blouse and those dagger-sharp eyes behind a honeyed smile. Daniel, Edward, you boys are persistent, she purred. The will has been legally recognized. You don't stand a chance. I stepped even closer, refusing to break eye contact. Vanessa, you know the truth, I said, my voice steel. My father would never turn his back on our family. If you're so confident, then show us the original will. Or are you afraid of something? For a split second, the mask cracked. I saw something behind her eyes, a flicker of panic, a crack in the icy armor, before she quickly masked it again. You want to play legal games? Fine, she hissed, her smile returning like a blade. Talk to my lawyer. She turned on her heel, the door slamming so hard, I felt the vibration through my boots. Edward stood beside me, fists balled, tears rimming his eyes. Daniel. He choked out, we can't let them win. I put a hand on his shoulder. We won't. I promise. As we walked back to the car, the mansion loomed behind us, still cold, still full of ghosts. But for the first time in weeks, I felt hope that we could reclaim it. The legal fight started in earnest after that. Graham filed motions, digging in with the precision of a surgeon, demanding the will be reviewed and the trust recognized. Wallace, oily and sharp, countered with every weapon he could muster, painting Dad as a man who willingly changed everything at the last moment. Vanessa kept up her act in court, wearing expensive black dresses, dabbing at imaginary tears while Hazel pretended to look devastated beside her. Each hearing was torture, like wrestling a snake that kept growing new heads. But then, a miracle. One morning, my phone rang. Graham's voice on the other end was electric with excitement. Daniel, he said, nearly breathless, get down to my office. Now. My heart jackhammered as I drove across town. When I stepped into his office, Graham was practically glowing, holding up a small USB drive like a prize trophy. Daniel, he said, his voice cracking just a little, we found it. I stared at him, barely daring to breathe. Someone from your father's company had a backup of the trust, stored in the internal servers. It has Russell's digital signature, verified by a notary. I carried the USB like a lifeline all the way back to my small apartment. When I opened my laptop and pulled up the file, my heart nearly stopped. The trust document was clear, detailed, and real, outlining exactly what Dad had wanted. The mansion, most of the assets, to go to Edward and me. A small portion set aside for Vanessa, just enough so she wouldn't be left on the street. My throat tightened as I read Dad's signature at the bottom, the familiar swoop of his pen unmistakable. The date matched perfectly. Dad never abandoned us. I whispered, tears pricking my eyes. I called Edward right away. Edward, I said, my voice shaking, we found it. The real trust. His breath hitched on the other end of the line. You mean, Dad really did leave it to us? Yes, little brother, I choked out. This is the truth. He never gave up on us. A month later, we faced Vanessa one last time in the final hearing. The courtroom felt like a furnace. Every eye turned on us as Graham stood and presented the trust from the USB. Wallace tried to weave around it, tried to cast doubt, but with the notary's verification and the digital signature, their arguments crumbled. When the judge ruled that Dad's will had been forged and the trust represented his true wishes, I closed my eyes and felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Beside me, Edward gripped my hand so tightly it hurt, but I welcomed the pain. Vanessa and Hazel sat there as if the air had been knocked from their lungs, faces pale, no words left to spin. I looked at Vanessa across the aisle, searching her eyes. You lost, I told her, my voice steady, though it trembled with a quiet grief. But what I regret most is that you stole my final moments with my father. She didn't answer, didn't even flinch. She just rose, cold as stone, and gathered Hazel to leave. As they passed, Edward turned to her, voice shaking but strong. You can't ever take Dad from us. Not really. Vanessa didn't look back. When the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, Edward and I stood together, letting it sink in. We did it, he said, wiping his eyes. Mom and Dad would be proud. I pulled him into a hug, my tears flowing freely now. Yes, little brother. We preserved their legacy. A week later, we returned to the mansion. As we walked through the iron gate, I felt like I was truly coming home for the first time in years. Inside, everything felt hushed, almost waiting. We moved through the halls, passing by walls stripped of Vanessa's cold modern art. The rooms felt like they could breathe again. In Dad's study, I found his old watch, still resting where he'd always left it, a silent sentinel. I ran my thumb across the worn leather strap, imagining his hands working late into the night. Edward, meanwhile, emerged from the master bedroom clutching Dad's notebook, filled with small entries about Mom, her laugh, her favorite songs, even notes about what flowers she loved to plant in spring. "Daniel," he called, voice breaking, "look at this." I glanced through the pages with him, each one a window to a happier past. "We're going to keep all of this safe," I told him, swallowing a wave of emotion. "For them." "Yeah," he nodded, smiling through tears, "for them." Living there didn't feel right. Too many ghosts, too many echoes of what had been lost. So Edward and I made the decision together. "We'll turn it into a community center," I said one evening as we stood on the front steps, looking over the garden. Edward nodded immediately. Mom would have loved that. Kids laughing, art classes, books, just like she always wanted. We set the plan in motion. Slowly, the mansion changed. Its grand halls filled with children's voices, with paintings and stories and laughter, everything Mom had believed in. Standing in the garden, where her roses had once bloomed, I felt a peace I thought I'd lost forever. The morning sunlight slipped through the pine trees, throwing dappled gold across the old stone. It looked just as it had when Edward and I were kids, running through the yard, thinking nothing could ever change. Now, the gray walls no longer felt like a battlefield, no longer soaked in betrayal. They stood tall, carrying the echoes of my parents' dreams. This house, this place, had become again what they meant it to be, a living, breathing monument to family, love, and the legacy my parents built with their hearts. One evening, Edward and I sat together in the center's living room, a space that still held the echo of our parents' warmth even though it had been transformed. The walls carried fresh paint now, lined with children's drawings and quotes from Dad's old notebook, but somehow, it felt just as safe as those fireside nights long ago. Edward curled up on the couch, still clutching Dad's notebook, running his fingers over its weathered leather cover. "Daniel," he said, his voice softer than usual, "do you ever think about how close we came to losing all of this?" I nodded, staring into the flickering light of a lamp. It reminded me of the glow of our old fireplace. "Yeah," I answered, voice quiet but steady. "Every single day. If Graham hadn't found the trust, if you hadn't kept fighting, if we'd given up, everything they built would have been gone." Edward's eyes glimmered, but there was a steadiness in him now I hadn't seen before, the look of a man, not the scared boy I'd once tried to shield. "I think Mom and Dad would have forgiven us," he said, his tone thoughtful, "even if we had lost." My chest tightened. I reached across the couch and gripped his shoulder, firm but gentle. "They would have," I agreed. But I couldn't forgive myself. This was our job, Edward. Their legacy, it was ours to protect. Edward smiled faintly, a little sadness in the corners of his eyes. "We protected it," he whispered. "Together." I leaned back against the cushions, letting my shoulders relax, taking in the sound of distant laughter drifting from the garden outside. "That's what matters," I told him. "Not the house, or the money, or even the name. It's the love they left us. That's what we're keeping alive." He nodded, his grip on Dad's notebook tightening like an anchor. "I believe that," he said, voice firm. "I really do." I took a slow breath, letting the peace of the center sink into me, the voices of children echoing through the hallways, the smell of fresh paint mixed with the faintest trace of Mom's old roses that still lingered in the garden. For the first time in a long time, I felt like a son again, not just a soldier, not just a protector, but someone who could carry love forward instead of only fighting battles. And there, sitting side by side with my brother in the center's living room, I finally felt like I was home. I looked at Edward across the living room, the afternoon sunlight painting streaks across the old wooden floor. His face looked lighter somehow, no longer weighed down by grief the way it once was. "Little brother," I said quietly, feeling my chest tighten with pride, "I'm proud of you." He lifted his eyes to me, shining and clear, and for the first time in what felt like years, I saw a smile, a real one, full and unbroken by sadness. "I'm proud of you too, Daniel," he replied, voice warm and steady. "We made it through." As for Vanessa and Hazel, they were gone. After the court's final ruling, they had vanished from our lives completely, slipping away to another city with only the small amount Dad had left Vanessa in the trust. A part of me wanted to feel triumphant, vindicated, but as I stood there with Edward, I realized I didn't. Mom always taught us that compassion was not weakness, but strength. I couldn't and wouldn't forgive what Vanessa and Hazel had done, but I refused to let hate eat away at what was left of my heart. Their lives, built on nothing but scheming and lies, would be their own punishment. That was enough. I took a slow breath, letting the echoes of the Center, Martin House, surround me. The chatter of children in the art room, the smell of fresh paint, the laughter outside in the garden where Dad once walked in the evenings. I finally understood what Mom tried to teach us when she was alive. That real strength is more than a clenched fist, more than a battle won. In the military, I had been trained to be tough, to stare down an enemy without flinching. But here, in my own family story, I realized the real enemies weren't Vanessa or Hazel. No, the true enemies were doubt, pain, and the cracks in our hearts that let fear seep through. I fought this battle not just to reclaim a mansion, but to protect the values my parents had spent a lifetime giving us: love, loyalty, responsibility. My story doesn't end here. Life will keep throwing challenges in my path. Some I can see coming, others I can't. But I'm not afraid anymore. I have Edward beside me. I have Martin House, a living memory of what our parents built. I have every lesson they ever gave us etched deep inside my soul. Family, despite every loss, every betrayal, is the most precious thing we have. Love and loyalty will always overcome any trial. And a true legacy isn't measured by wealth, but by the values we pass on, one heart to the next. I, Daniel Martin, will keep living, keep fighting, and keep loving, just as my parents taught me. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.